The year was 1878, and the desert stretched wide and silent, painted in tones of gold and rust beneath a merciless sun. Clara Hayes lived alone on a patch of land too dry for corn and too far from town for comfort. The wind was her only company, whistling through the brittle mesquite and cracked barn boards. Most days passed without a word spoken, but that morning the quiet broke. A sharp cry, faint but human, carried on the heat like a ghost's call. Clara stopped mid-step, her hand frozen on the water bucket, eyes narrowing toward the hills. She thought it was a coyote at first. Then she heard it again, pain, low and ragged, coming from the dry wash near the edge of her fence line. Instinct told her to stay put. The plains weren't kind to the curious, and not all cries for help were what they seemed. But loneliness had a way of dulling fear, and Clara was tired of pretending she didn't care. She took her Winchester from its hook, slung a canteen over her shoulder, and started walking toward the sound. The land shimmered beneath her boots, waves of heat rising from the sand. By the time she reached the gully, her shirt clung to her back, and her breath came dry. Then she saw him. A man half hidden in the dust, skin the color of red earth, dark hair tangled with sweat and grit. His leg was caught in an old bear trap, iron teeth rusted but cruelly tight. Blood had soaked through his buckskin pants and pooled in the sand. A Comanche. Her pulse quickened. Trouble. For a long moment, she simply stood there. He didn't move, though his eyes opened slowly, dark, wary, and burning with pain. "Don't," he rasped as she stepped closer. Clara froze. She could see the faint tremor of his hands, the way he reached instinctively toward his belt before realizing his knife was gone. "I ain't gonna hurt you," she said quietly, her voice dry as the wind. Still, she could feel her heart thudding in her chest. She'd heard stories, ranchers found dead, caravans ambushed, but there was no hate in his eyes, only exhaustion. The trap was cruel work. Its springs were jammed with rust, the jaws biting deep into flesh. Every inch of her told her to walk away, to leave this man to whatever fate had caught him. But she saw the blood, thick and black at the edges, and her hand trembled. Hold still," she whispered. He flinched when she knelt beside him, her shadow falling across his face. The metal burned her fingers when she touched it, and she winced. "This'll hurt," she muttered. "Do it," he breathed, jaw clenched. Then she pried the jaws apart with a groan of effort. The sound that came from him wasn't human. It was raw and deep, torn from somewhere beneath the ribs. He collapsed back into the sand, clutching his leg, breath coming in short bursts. Clara tore a strip from her petticoat, pressing it against the wound to slow the bleeding. The desert was silent again, save for the distant whistle of wind. "You'll live," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. He didn't reply, just watched her with eyes that seemed to search her soul. When the bleeding slowed, she stood and backed away. "You're free now," she said softly. "Best find your way home before dark." He didn't move, didn't thank her. Just sat there, his chest rising and falling. Clara turned and walked back toward her ranch, not daring to look over her shoulder. Every instinct screamed that she'd just made a mistake, a woman alone helping a Comanche warrior. But something deeper in her chest felt different. Not fear, something quieter, something right. The sun was setting by the time she reached her porch. The sky bled crimson across the horizon, and the wind carried the faint smell of smoke from a distant campfire. She washed the blood from her hands, though the red stains clung stubbornly to her skin. That night she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. She thought of his eyes, haunted but steady, and wondered if he'd survived the night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes began to howl, their cries echoing across the empty land. When morning came, she found herself walking the same trail again. She told herself it was to check for signs of scavengers, or maybe her own peace of mind. But the spot where he had been was empty, only blood-stained sand and a broken chain where the trap had lain. She crouched, touching the dirt still damp beneath the rising sun. A part of her felt relief, another part regret. "Fool woman," she muttered, shaking her head. "You'll get yourself killed yet." But somewhere inside, She knew that wasn't the end of it. That evening, while bringing in firewood, she found something strange near her fence, a single feather, painted red at the tip, tied with a strip of leather. It fluttered in the wind, catching the last light of sunset. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. A warning, a token? She couldn't say, but she left it where it was. For the first time in years, she felt eyes on her when she stepped outside at night, watching, unseen, from beyond the cactus and the wind-worn hills. Days passed. The routine of chores dulled her nerves, but the memory of that moment never faded. She found herself glancing toward the ridge every morning, half expecting to see that dark figure again. Sometimes she thought she did, a shadow moving where the sun hit the rocks just right. Maybe he was gone. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, something had shifted in her. She no longer saw the desert as empty, but alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Mercy, she realized, didn't end when the act was done. It lingered, carving itself into your bones. On the fifth night, thunder rolled over the horizon, the first storm in weeks. Clara stood by the door, watching lightning split the sky. The wind howled across the plains, bending the scrub and rattling the shutters. She thought again of his eyes, dark as the storm clouds, steady as the earth itself. Somewhere out there, he was either dead or healing. Either way, their paths had crossed for a reason she couldn't yet name. She whispered a prayer into the wind, not sure who it was for, him, herself, or the wild land that bound them both. 3 days passed, and the desert carried a strange silence. Clara worked her land as always, but something in the wind felt different, charged, watchful. The horses paced restlessly in the corral, their ears twitching toward the horizon. That morning, when she stepped out with a pail of water, she saw dust rising far off in the east. It wasn't the slow drift of wind or cattle. It was riders, several of them moving fast, the sun glinting off metal and paint. Her heart sank, her mind racing back to the man she'd freed. Mercy, she realized, had come back wearing war paint. She ran to the porch, grabbing her rifle. Through the shimmer of heat, she could make out feathers and dark hair, the shape of bows and spears. Her breath caught. Comanche. For a fleeting second, fear took her whole body. She'd heard the stories. Raids. On ranches, settlers left with nothing but smoke. But when they stopped 100 yards from her fence line, no war cry followed. The leader dismounted, his limp unmistakable, his leg wrapped in cloth, torn from her own petticoat. Clara's grip on the rifle loosened, confusion battling with instinct. He raised a hand, not in threat but in greeting. The others followed, silent, watchful, a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on her. Clara swallowed hard. The man spoke then, his voice calm but edged with pride. "You freed me," he said. "Now we stand for you." The words hung heavy in the still air. She blinked, not sure she'd heard right. "For me," she repeated, her voice almost lost to the wind. He nodded once. "White men ride this way," he said. "Guns, smoke. They hunt a woman who helped the enemy." Her blood ran cold. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her. She'd known word would spread, but she hadn't thought it would happen so soon. Somewhere out there, soldiers from Fort Mason had learned of her mercy and branded it treason. "You should go," she said quickly, stepping off the porch. "They'll kill you if they see you here." The Comanche leader looked at her, calm and steady. "Then we stand," he replied. There was no bravado in his tone, just truth. His people dismounted, forming a quiet circle around her ranch. Clara's throat tightened. She'd saved one life, and now a dozen stood ready to risk theirs. By afternoon, the sound of hooves thundered from the north. Dust clouds billowed. As the posse from Fort Mason approached, 5 men in blue coats and dust masks, rifles slung across their shoulders. Clara's heart pounded. The Comanche warriors tensed, hands resting on bows. The two worlds collided at the edge of her land, the air thick enough to choke on. The lead soldier, a man with a scar along his jaw, shouted, "Step aside, ma'am! We're here for them!" Clara didn't move. The rifle trembled in her hands, not from fear, but from resolve. "Ain't nobody dying here today," she said. The soldier sneered. "You're protecting savages now?" His words struck like a whip. Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I'm protecting life," she said, voice steady. "Yours, theirs, mine. We all bleed the same color in this dust." Behind her, the Comanche stood still, their faces unreadable, waiting for her lead. The tension stretched thin as glass. A coyote howled in the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of gunpowder and sweat. For a moment, it seemed one spark could set the whole world aflame. Then, slowly, she lowered her rifle, but did not let go. The man with the scar spat in the dirt. "You'll hang for this, Hayes." Her name rolled off his tongue like a curse. "Maybe," she said softly, "but not today." His hand twitched toward his weapon, and before he could draw, a single arrow hit the sand at his feet, close enough to make him flinch. Every soldier froze, every Comanche tightened their grip, but the wounded warrior, the one she had freed, stepped forward. "No more blood," he said. "She showed mercy. So will we." His voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder over the plain. For a long time, nobody moved. The sun sank lower, painting the world in gold and red. Dust swirled around them like smoke. Finally, the soldier holstered his gun. "This ain't over," he muttered. Clara met his glare. "It never is," she said. He turned his horse, signaling the others. Slowly, the posse rode away, their silhouettes shrinking into the horizon. When the last hoofbeat faded, silence filled the world again, broken only by the whisper of wind through dry grass. Clara lowered her rifle, her shoulders shaking with the weight she hadn't realized she carried. The Comanche leader limped closer, his shadow long across the dirt. "You are brave," he said simply. She shook her head, eyes glistening. "No, just tired of watching good people die." He nodded once, understanding more than her words. From a pouch at his belt, he drew out a small leather charm, bound with a turquoise stone, and pressed it into her hand. "You walk the path between worlds," he told her. "Both will remember." Then, with a sharp whistle, he turned to his riders. One by one, they mounted their horses and rode off into the dying sun. Clara stood there long after they'd gone, the charm still warm in her palm. The wind carried the echo of hooves, until even that faded into silence. She looked out over the plains. Her land stretched wide beneath the crimson sky. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. Mercy, she thought, wasn't weakness. It was defiance. In a world built on vengeance, she had chosen something harder. As the first stars began to pierce the dusk, Clara Hayes whispered a quiet thank you to the empty horizon, knowing the desert had heard her and somehow would remember her name. When night fell, she lit a lantern and set it by the window, its soft glow spilling out across the sand. Maybe it was a signal, or maybe just a habit she couldn't shake. Either way, it felt right. Out there somewhere, the warrior she'd saved was alive. And so was she, bound by something the frontier couldn't break. The West would go on burning as it always did, but in one small cabin at the edge of nowhere, a single light stayed lit, and in that light, the Wild West found a kind of peace it had never known before.